Okay, so we are Group 2, and we have Chapter 8, which talks about governance and the policies to increase value and enhance growth. So this section of the book relates to governance and how important it is for platforms and companies to find success. Simply, governance means who gets to participate, how to divide up the earnings, and how to resolve conflicts. It mostly relates to how companies are managed and operate within their respective markets. The ability to have strong and positive governance works in the automate stage of the framework and reflects a company's ability to make use of the new information they have. There are 3 fundamental rules of governance. The first is always create values for the customers you serve. Next is don't use power to change rules in your favor. And finally, don't take more than a fair share of the wealth. By following these, companies should be in good standing in the governance department. One example of a company that didn't do that was Keurig. With Keurig's launch of their 2.0 version of the coffee maker, they saw a decline in sales rather than growth. This was because their patent on K-Cups had expired, so other brands came out with cheaper versions that were more appealing to customers. Their response to this issue is what showed poor governance, because Keurig decided to make their machines only read Keurig brand K-Cups, resulting in changing the rules and angering consumers. By doing this, they also took away more than a fair share of their wealth and upset everyone in the market. Today, some of the largest platforms in the world, such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, and LinkedIn, deal with more people and oversee populations comparable to some of the largest countries in the world. Facebook specifically oversees a population larger than China's and a massive economy bigger than most countries. The difference between these entities is that states have had centuries or decades to learn what works, and platforms are all of a sudden dealing with foreign policy, multi-sided interests, and alienated users. Governance is the major factor in all of this. What companies need to learn is how to rule wisely and profit rather than make it all about the profits, and with that, governance is a huge opportunity for wealth. One state example of the importance of governance is Singapore. Not until recently did Singapore truly take off as an economy, and that is because of the introduction of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Rather than focus on the ancient traditions, he focused on eliminating corruption, changing the system of governance, and bringing in multicultural councils. These 3 actions allowed for the overall corruption state to decrease 1%, which in turn led to a 1.7% increase in GDP. And today, Singapore is home to a booming international economy. Platforms have the opportunity to learn from this and build themselves in a way that reflects positive governance in order to increase wealth.
So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to be talking about market failure and its 4 causes. So market failure is defined as a situation in which good interactions fail to occur and bad interactions do. So a good interaction is when both parties are mutually satisfied with the transaction. That's a good interaction. And a bad interaction, the book uses this example, is when this is just one example. It's not the only bad interaction that can happen, but on eBay, someone had found a bottle of beer that they didn't realize that was made in the 1850s, but they didn't realize that there were only 2 other of those bottles of beer in existence, and they posted it on eBay as Allsop's Arctic Ale. But what they messed up one letter, so they misspelled it. So the people who were looking for that ale, which are historians and beer fanatics, didn't see that posting on eBay. But someone who was looking up for misspelled words, a buyer looking for certain things with misspelled words that wouldn't normally come up, found it and ended up paying $304 in total for it. But 3 days later, they put it back up on eBay, correctly spelled, and ended up selling it for $78,100. So that's just one example. That's an example of information asymmetry, and it's an example of a bad interaction. But a bad interaction happens when you find an item you wanted but got cheated, abused, or deceived. And the 4 causes of market failure: Number 1 is information asymmetry, and that's what I just talked about with the last example. Number 2 is monopoly power. The 3rd one is externalities, and the 4th one is risk. Alright, so moving more deeply into the 4 causes of market failures, I'm just going to explain each one and give some examples. Information asymmetry, which is what we talked about, what I talked about in the last example, with the spelling error and stuff like that. But that's when one party in an interaction knows facts that other parties don't and uses that knowledge for personal advantage. So another example is counterfeit goods, where one person may be selling a good that they're saying is Gucci or Louis Vuitton or another expensive designer brand on it, and they're saying it's authentic, but they know it's not authentic, and the buyer is not aware of that fact. So that is market failure. That's a bad interaction. Moving on to monopoly power. Monopoly power is when one supplier in an ecosystem becomes too powerful because of its control of the supply of a widely sought good and uses this power to demand higher prices or special favor. So an example the book used was Zynga, and this was really popular in 2009 and 2010 on Facebook. They were a game maker on Facebook, and there were a lot of issues leading to conflicts over issues such as the sharing of user information, the split of gaming revenues, and the cost to Zynga of ads on the social network. And also, eBay has experienced similar problems dealing with so-called power sellers, or people who just sell many, many items on eBay. And the third cause of market failure is externalities, and that's when spillover costs or benefits accrue to anyone not involved in a given interaction. But these, it's important to note, can be good and bad. A bad externality would be if an industrial power plant was somehow dumping their waste into a town, and the people in the town were somehow getting affected by that dumping of waste or whatever it may be. That's an externality. So the deal didn't pertain to the people in the town, but they still were affected by that power plant. And there's also good externalities, though, in the sense that you could be part of a company which does a marathon run. They sponsor their employees to do a marathon run, and even though the people who are directly being affected by that money that the people are raising for the cause are not part of that transaction necessarily, they're still being benefited from it. And the fourth cause of market failure is risk, and risk is important to note. It exists in all markets, and it's the possibility that something unexpected and essentially unpredictable may go wrong, turning a good interaction into a bad one. So if we're using the example of eBay, for example, you may purchase an item, and the item was getting shipped in a car which got in an accident, or some sort of shipping. There was some sort of shipping delay, or because of a storm or some sort of natural disaster that caused the package to be lost. That is a risk that no party could have predicted, and it was already a good interaction. The transaction was done. Both parties were receiving something of value, except from that unknown and unexpected event, the good interaction has now turned into a bad one because now the person buying that item is not satisfied.
Okay, so for the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about some of the tools for governance. The first tool that I'm going to talk about are laws. The laws of a platform are kind of like the explicit rules that moderate behavior at the user and ecosystem level. So, for example, we can think of things like terms of service, those really long paragraphs that you never read when you install software. And like an example of a law on the user level is how, if you have an Apple account, you can share digital content that you purchased between up to like 6 devices. And then another Apple example for the ecosystem level is when a developer submits an app to the App Store, they have to submit their code for review to Apple. And so therefore Apple can verify that the code and the function of the app follows kind of the laws and rules that Apple has put in place. Platform laws should be transparent to promote good practices as well. And so for things like good behavior, you want to have fast and open feedback when applying these laws. And then for bad behavior, you want to have slow and opaque feedback. And so we can kind of think of this like if a user does something good, we want to promote that behavior, by kind of instantly letting them know, like, hey, that's good behavior. And the slow and opaque thing with bad behavior is sort of like if a user knows what they're doing is bad behavior, and if they instantly kind of get feedback and like a slap on the wrist and know that they've done something wrong, it's a lot easier to sort of game the system and kind of toe the line of these bad rules. And so with slow and opaque feedback, users, they can't really game the system as easily. Another tool for governance are norms. Norms are informal codes of behavior that are shaped by culture. Norms don't come from a vacuum. They reflect behaviors, which means they can kind of be constructed using disciplined design. And it's desirable for a platform for users to participate in shaping the systems that govern them. And so we can take an example from the text where the owner of iStockPhoto, which is a website that hosts and uploads and shares stock photographs for different companies and users to use. But essentially, iStockPhoto was curating all these photographs. It was really difficult to hire enough employees to keep scaling the business up, and so they turned to crowd curation. And so essentially, the owner of iStockPhoto started promoting kind of a good behavior and good behavioral norms, and rewarding users for quality content curation. Another tool for governance is architecture. Architecture kind of refers to programming code. So like, sort of the programming behind the platform. And so like a well-designed software system is self-improving. An example the text gives is like an online banking company that it refers to uses like a peer-to-peer lending service that uses a complex algorithm to create loans and do business. And so essentially this algorithm can determine, based off of a user's data, what kind of rate they should be getting, and if, they qualify for this loan or how likely they are to default on a loan. And over time, the company can improve this algorithm and make it more efficient and more accurate. In addition to these things, this algorithm can also, make the company more competitive because the company can offer better loan rates because their overhead cost isn't as much because they aren't having to pay employees to do all this. The program, the algorithm does all of this for the company. The last tool for governance is markets. Markets can govern behavior through the use of mechanism design and various incentives like fun, fame, and fortune, otherwise known as social currency. The text really focuses on this concept of social currency. And social currency is sort of this something that you kind of have to give in order to get. And so you can think of this as like your reputation as a seller or a buyer on eBay. You withhold, you uphold on your end, and you buy something from a buyer and you give them a good buyer rating. If everything goes fine, they'll give you a good seller rating as well. We can think of this as your follower count on Twitter, connections you've made on LinkedIn, sort of contributions that you're making to social media. How interesting your stuff is gets people to follow you. It's sort of this kind of network effect.
Next, we're going to talk about the principles of smart self-governance for platforms. The first principle is the principle of internal transparency. Without the concept of internal transparency, departments within the company have the tendency to be siloed or develop individual characteristics that create difficulties when working with outsiders or other departments. So in turn, this makes it extremely difficult to solve complex and large-scale problems that involve multiple departments or divisions. To avoid this type of dysfunctionality, platform managers should strive to give all of the division and department managers a clear view across the entire platform. And one company who truly embodies the principle of internal transparency is Amazon Web Services. Andrew Jassy, Amazon's Vice President of Technology, urges that their projects are combined into a single operation that is clear and concise that all departments can comprehend. Thanks to this vision from Jassy, Amazon Web Services has more market share than the next dozen cloud services combined. A sobering example of the dysfunctionality that comes with a lack of internal transparency is Sony Corporation. Sony never developed a vision to support and offer a sustainable platform, so their siloed vision prevented them from creating a unified platform ecosystem. The second principle is the principle of participation, and this principle keeps external partners and stakeholders involved while also giving them a voice. Participation from all parties truly prevents decisions being made only in favor of the platform. One company who truly embodies the principle of participation is Intel, particularly in the ecosystem that they built around the Universal Serial Bus, or USB. By earning the trust of their partners through communication, Intel was able to advocate for the USB and justify the need for something that had not yet been adopted by customers. United from the participation behind the USB, Intel was able to produce a successfully evolving ecosystem that lasted more than a decade. These two principles bring us back to a deep principle from earlier in this chapter. Just and fair governance can create wealth. Fairness can help create wealth in two main ways. If you treat people fairly, they'll be more apt to share their ideas. And fair governance also leads to market participants allocating their resources in a more wise and productive manner. Governance is always changing and will always be imperfect, so successful governance platforms should be ready to evolve in response. However, regardless of what kind of business or social ecosystem your platform resides in, there will always be a fast-moving and slow-moving component. So, a smart governance system is flexible enough to respond to both.